And Lydia is the programme manager for the Living Wage Foundation, covering West and North London, and is also involved in the project to make London a living wage city, which our Bishop Sarah is also involved in, and the Mayor Sadiq Khan. So we're really grateful for you to join us on such a busy week, Lydia. I wondered if you could just talk from the Living Wage Foundation point of view, because you collect some really helpful data. You know, Angus has made the moral and theological case for it, but what's the practical benefits of you know, of accrediting to the living wage? And I don't know if you're able to share something of that and the research that you're doing at the Living Wage Foundation.
Yeah, definitely. I'll go into that in this presentation. So I just want to share kind of, I know that Angus has already shared a little bit about the history of the movement, and also talk about some of our achievements to date and the real benefits, because I think we talk a lot about the business benefits, which might not be as relevant in this kind of sector with churches, but there are obviously obvious social benefits that we can go into as well. So hopefully everyone can see this, and I can share these slides after today as well. So yeah, I'm just going to go into the kind of why and how of accreditation and kind of demystify the process a little bit. So as we've already discussed, the Living Wage campaign all began in 2001. Where members of the community, they were part of the East London branch of Citizens, and it was namely churches and mosques who were kind of fundamental in kickstarting the movement. And what these people had in common was that they were all working minimum wage, really low paid jobs, normally several jobs, and still weren't having enough at the end of the month to spend on their family, and also didn't have the time to spend with their families. And from there, the Living Wage movement was born. The first big organisation that was accredited was Barclays Bank, and from then the Living Wage Foundation, which I'm now happy to work for, was founded in 2011 and kind of formalised the accreditation process, and we've grown from that point really. So it was last year that we celebrated 20 years of the Living Wage campaign. So the positive news is that so far our movement has put £2 billion back into the pockets of low paid workers. £1 billion of that has been in London as a result of the campaign. We've lifted nearly 400,000 workers onto the real living wage so far, and we now have over 11,000 accredited living wage employers and organisations across the UK. We usually announce our living wage rates, which are announced annually. We normally announce them at the beginning of Living Wage Week, but this year we announced them early, kind of in response to the cost of living crisis, because employers were asking what they could do now to support their employees. So we got the rates calculation early, so they're now £10.90 in the UK generally, and then £11.95 in London to reflect the higher cost of living here in the capital. And there is a bit of confusing language, I think, around the living wage, because the government very helpfully brought out their own national living wage, which they used our wording for. So just to explain the difference between the national living wage and the real living wage, we think the national living wage is actually being updated today. I think Jeremy Hunt is at this very moment speaking on that in the Commons. But the national living wage is currently £9.50, and there's no London weighting attached to it either. So it's obviously quite a big drop compared to the £10.90 that we have. It only applies if you're 23 and older. So if you go into work when you're 18, you're not entitled to the national living wage. You're only entitled to the minimum wage, which is £9.18. And it's not actually based on the real cost of living. It's based on a quite difficult calculation of a percentage of median earnings that is wanting to be reached by 2024. Whereas the real living wage is based on the cost of living. It's calculated independently every year by the Resolution Foundation, and it's based on things like the minimum income standard, so what people need to get by day, and also have enough to, actually live life rather than just exist. So what the Living Wage Foundation does is we celebrate and recognise organisations that have gone the extra step of accrediting as living wage employers to ensure, like Angus said, so it's not just saying, this year we are paying the living wage, it's saying that, we commit to doing this year on year and ensuring that all of our employees have enough to live on as these new rates are announced. So we act as an accreditation body, so we give employers the accreditation mark of living wage employer, which they can share widely and become part of our network. We also provide intelligence, so we are quite prolific in terms of our reports and our research that we put out We recently released a bit of research on life on low pay, on what the kind of day-to-day reality is on living if you're being paid below the living wage, and also influencing as well. So it can be, you know, smaller events like this with specific employers such as churches, but it's also speaking to local authorities and governments on kind of what paying the living wage can do more broadly. So some of these are from the recent report that we just put out, so Life on Low Pay, but it's just to paint a obviously fairly grim picture. You know, low pay has been an issue for a number of years, but it's obviously really been brought into the forefront recently. So we know that in the UK, there's 1 in 6 workers who are earning below the living wage. We know that in-work poverty is really biting at the moment, and 2 in 3 children in poverty do actually have a parent in work. Inflation is increasing constantly, it would seem, so the squeeze on low-income families is intensifying even more. And this piece of research is from what we've just done that says that 56% of workers who are paid below the living wage have actually had to use a food bank in the last 12 months. So these people who do have jobs, but because they're not being paid the living wage, have had to resort to using food banks to feed themselves and their families. And this is a quote from Helen. She works at a cleaning agency in Nottingham. She was previously working for an organisation that paid minimum wage and then moved over to a living wage employer. And she talks about how she was having to duct tape her shoes back together. She couldn't afford heating in her flat. She had to go around to her friend's house to, you know, get fed because she couldn't afford enough food to feed herself on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, she felt really embarrassed by that. And she talks about how her life changed when she was paid the living wage, because it meant that not only could she afford the, you know, necessities like food, but it also meant that she could have her friends over and, you know, actually, as I said earlier, enjoy life rather than just existing. And she says at the end, which really rings true, if you're working, you should be able to afford to have a. So obviously we have over 11,000 employers in our network. I think maybe perception is that most of them would be, you know, big businesses, and while we are really happy to have, you know, large employers in our network, 80% of those are actually small, medium-sized businesses and organisations, including many in the public sector, who have joined not only to uplift their employees onto the living wage, but also ensure that they're being paid that living wage year on year. So I know that Angus has already spoken on why it's important for churches, and I know that Reverend James is going to go into that as well. But what accrediting as kind of a member of the community does, so that could be a church or another faith institution or a school, is that it makes a statement in solidarity with low-paid people who might be in your congregation, who would probably benefit from knowing that the church that they were attending was kind of, as I said, walking the walk in the fight against poverty, and, you know, proudly stating that they are a living wage employer. It's also a way to represent the community in which they belong. So when organisations become living wage accredited, they appear on our local map that some people use to work out who are the living wage employers in their area, and it means that your church would appear on that map alongside other members of the community, as well as businesses who have all taken this step to become accredited as living wage employers. So the admin behind accreditation, it can be difficult, but it's not for smaller organisations. So when we talk about the accreditation process, it's slightly more laborious for big businesses who have got thousands of contracts, like a local authority, and that can maybe take months to process because they have to go to them and ask what wage they're currently on. But for smaller organisations, it's just this 3-step process. So you would need to be paying the real living wage to your staff at the point of accreditation. So say in London, £11.95 an hour and £10.90 outside of London. So that needs to be true before accreditation. If you did have any third-party contracts, which is more unlikely if it's a small organisation, then that's something that we would have to look at, and that's just mapped out in a different document. And then the final step is just completing a short application form online. It shouldn't take longer than half an hour, but might take less time than that. And once that's all processed, then you would become an accredited living wage employer. So say that means that you will be able to carry our logo, you'll be able to use it on your correspondence. We know that a lot of organisations like to have a big sticker on their doors so that people walking through know straight away that they're a living wage employer. You'd appear on our website and, as say, on our employer map so that you can, proudly show it in the local area as well. But it also means that you would become part of this movement of over 11,000 organisations that are doing the right thing and are supporting their staff and wider communities in the cost of living crisis, and be invited to events like this, but also kind of wider events that we have as part of Living Wage Week and beyond, to talk about why you became a living wage employer and how it's benefited you, which I know that Reverend James is going to go into later. So I think in the 2-pager we're happy to share the link, which just leads to the accreditation document. If you were to put in an inquiry, then you would just be assigned someone at the foundation who would carry that through, depending on where you were. But yeah, I'm really happy to answer any questions on the end about the accreditation process, and like costs and any logistics that come into it as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. That's brilliant. Really helpful, and really helpful to have the whole sort of picture from beginning to end. And we'll talk shortly to James about his experience of the accreditation process, but you've made that really clear. Thank you.